I'm Andrew Shaxson, and I was born on the 12th of January 1950.
Jolly good. And you've lived in this area all your life?
Yes, yes, other than going to boarding school.
So perhaps if you could tell us a little bit about your earliest memories, your family, how long they've been associated with the area?
Hmm. Well, my family aren't a farming family. Well, my father's family are not a farming family. They bought the farm in 1932, and previous to that, my father's family were discount bankers in London, having been previous to that master mariners from North Devon. But my mother's family were farmers. They were farming. They've been farming in Somerset for as far back as I can go, which is 350 years or more. So there's certainly farming in the blood in that respect. My earliest memories, goodness me, everything tends to sort of. It's very difficult to know whether they're your memories or what you've been told at that early age. But I can remember three things from when I was 4 years old. I'm a cat, definitely, who's had a number of his 9 lives. I fell in a swimming pool with gumboots on and no one else was around, and I managed to pull myself out at 4 years old. I fell out of a car in the middle of Harting. The doors which opened forwards, I shot out of the car and it opened forwards. And I managed to set light to a barn when I was 4 years old. Um, and so you're probably quite lucky to be speaking to me today. But as far as hard facts, probably I can remember isolated things, but things have definitely changed. And I think I was probably born on the cusp of labour-intensive agriculture, and when really people began to specialise in certain areas of agriculture. So either just um, one or two um, enterprises, or they had smaller labour farm staff to do it. So the farm cottages were sold in the early 60s to incomers, and much smaller numbers of people started to work on the farm.
It definitely seems the recurring theme is that change started to happen and accelerate in the early 60s onwards, in terms of people moving off the land, in terms of dairy farms giving away to arable and that sort of alteration.
Yes, really, to confirm, yes, I was told this farm once employed 40 men on it. And it employed 40 men, and some had full-time jobs as people who dug ditches, a rabbit catcher. There were hedgers who were full-time, because of course they did it all by hand. There was no machinery. And now, if you want to cut a hedge, you stick a piece of machinery on the back of a tractor and you go and cut it, and you cut many miles in a day. In the past, it was an enormous job. It was all done by sweated labour. And we cannot comprehend how different things are. There was a grain dryer put into the building here in the 1930s, which was really very top of the market when it was put in, and it could take it dried 4 tons of grain an hour. Well, the combines at the time, that was wonderful, but now there are combines sold which can convert 100 tons of grain an hour. One combine, its spot cutting rate is 100 tons an hour. Things have changed so vastly in the last, well, my lifetime, or slightly more than my lifetime, which is 71 years, but one wonders what on earth it can be like in 70 years' time. I just cannot comprehend what it can be like.
No, so when you were a small child, were there still quite a lot of people employed on the farm then?
Oh yes, I've got old. I've got the wages books, and not only are there large numbers of people in those wages books, but of course the sums of money that they earned in a week was less than they earn in an hour today, and they weren't well paid. But when I say to you that the average wage, and I can remember this from really the mid-50s, that they were paid about £6 10 shillings a week for a 48-hour week. and it's hard to believe that they could get by on that.
Did they have accommodation?
Yes, I mean a tithe cottage. If a farmer wished to do so, he could charge 10 shillings a week. That's 50p a week for a tithe cottage at that time. But some people didn't have tithe cottages, so they would have to pay the council or another private landlord for the rent.
And do you remember the farm workers from those times? 'Cause what I'm thinking here is their personality, the Sussex accent, that they steeped in tradition, that sort of.
Oh yes. Well, we've still one still lives in the village. He was 89 the other day, and he came and worked on the farm. He's worked here or lived here since he was 14 years old, and he has some memories and a half. Perhaps he's somebody for you to talk to
Very
at some
likely,
stage.
yeah.
But he of course was working on the farm, as I put it, before the cusp. He came onto the farm as a horseman, so he worked under the head carter on the farm, and there are photographs of young Fred with a horse. My grandfather took many cine films, which are in fact in the South East England Farmer archive
At Chichester.
at Chichester, and there's photographs of him, or a film of him doing some work with a horse. But I can remember all sorts of odd people who worked on the farm, and some of them were pretty odd as well. And you talk about accents, yes, some had wonderful accents, not the least being a person you've probably heard of, who, in spite of dying in 1970, I got to know quite well because he was a publican of a local pub, a man called Alf Ainger.
Oh yes, yeah, Hooksway.
He was publican there from 1907 until his death in 1970. And I often wonder whether anybody, that first night he was there, he thought, well, I'll still be here in 1970. But he was a heck of a character, and he had quite a it was a place which was renowned for over a very wide area.
Tell us something about your memories of that then, of the pub and him and his wife as well, wasn't there?
Carrie, yes. Carrie was the daughter of a lock keeper at Birdham Lock, which no, not the lock keeper. Carrie was the daughter of a tide mill at Birdham, and of course the tide pond at Birdham is now the marina. And Alf Ainger's father was the lock keeper of the bottom lock, the sea lock, and the next lock up, which was the first lock into the canal, his father's brother was the lock keeper. So obviously Alf got to know Carrie Cribb, quite well as a result of that. And Carrie's ancestor was the undefeated bare fist champion of England. And Carrie, Alf originally came as a cowman and worked for a farmer in Treyford, the next door village to the east of here, and his father was the landlord of the Royal Oak for 4 years before him, and then Alf took over from his father, and Alf was in his 20s then and probably thought at the time, oh well, this is a standing job until I do something else, but it wasn't. He was carried out feet first. But I was taken there. I remember being told, rather than recall it, that after Findon Sheep Fair we took our sheep to Findon one day, and my father, the farm shepherd, I think the chap who's still alive who lives in the village, and one or two others, we came back from Findon, and we came back via Hooksway, and my father said to me afterwards that I'd taken you there so that you could experience the Royal Oak at Hooksway, because of course even by then Alf had been there for 50 years, and he thought, you won't know it. Well, of course I did. I even could legally drink in that pub, and did. But it was, the stories are legion about it. You'll find a lot of people who can tell you a lot of stories about that pub.
And he had quite a dry sense of humour.
Yes, he was one of these people, I don't know if you've come upon them, who was deaf until he wanted to hear something. And his wife was very much the same. I've come upon a few people like that who have pretend to be deaf until they either hear something they want to hear, or you say something slightly disparaging about them or somebody they get upset about.
And it was just a pub with beer, wasn't it? There wouldn't have been any food or anything like that.
I think they would throw you a piece of bread and cheese
bread and
and a
cheese.
pickled onion if you could cope with it. But the other thing too about it, it was most upsetting. It was a Tamplin's house originally, and Tamplin's brewery was taken over. Half the pubs were taken over by. Well, let's get this right. Were taken over by Friary Mew, and the other half by, well, I forget. No, it was a Henty pub, Henty Constable pub, and half the Henty Constable pubs were taken over by Friary Mew from Guildford, and the other half by Tamplin's. The Tamplin's pubs eventually became part of Watney's. The disadvantage of drinking at the Royal Oak at Hooksway in my time was Watney's Red Barrel. Anybody, you're too young, I should remember to. I should imagine
I
to
certainly
know.
remember the adverts for it.
Yes, but I suspect others can remember what Watney's Red Barrel tasted like, and it was disgusting stuff, absolutely evil. And of course, that was the brew you had to have there because it was either that or cider.
Right.
Or probably some British sherry or something like that. But anyway, you didn't go there for the beer. You went there for the atmosphere and for the people, and for lack of public lavatories.
Yes, I've heard about that as well. I suppose we ought to just define what the family farm did, because you just mentioned sheep. So what was the farming?
Well, in our time, we've done most things here. I don't know. I mentioned a grain dryer. We actually put in a grain dryer to dry. We put in a grass dryer originally in 1935 to dry grass because we thought that there would be a market in dried grass. Well, if there was, I don't think it was a very good market. So we've had on this locations around Elstead itself. We've had cows. We've milked cows in 5 different locations, and towards the end of the time that I knew cows, we had 220 in 3 locations, and eventually we had 160 here. And this house was built as a cowman's dwelling, and the farm buildings are behind you as I speak to you for those cows. But we stopped milking cows in 1991. We never had a beef herd. We kept pigs. We at one time we had up to 1,200 pigs on the farm. We've kept sheep. We had a flock of up to 300 ewes, which were largely kept on the top of the downs. We've grown potatoes here. We've grown sugar beet even. There was a big play to have a sugar beet factory in the south of England, in this area, very close to Chichester, in the 1930s, but it never came to anything. And in fact, our sugar beet was taken out and went to Kidderminster, to a sugar beet factory there, which I don't know if it still exists. But a lot of farmers around here did grow sugar beet, which killed the land, because you take sugar beet out late in the autumn, and the mess that the people made, cutting up the ground, destroying the soil structure, destroying the drainage, a lot of fields never really recovered. So we grew sugar beet up until 1956, 57, shortly after the railway from Petersfield to Midhurst was closed.
You saying that, I'm trying to think of the extent of the farm. So obviously it goes up onto the downs. So what is the geographical spread of the farm?
Well, when I remember it at its height, it was just over 1,000 acres.
That's big, isn't it?
It's ran from the outskirts of Harting to the outskirts of Treyford under the downs, and it ran onto the top of the downs and runs to the north of the village of Elstead. But it had all soil types. It was rather like the downland villages, everything from chalk to lower chalk to the upper greensand rock, which is beautiful soil, down onto fairly heavy galt clay. So we had a bit of everything to contend with. But we never grew hops. Many farms on the Upper Greensand grew hops. There were hops grown west of here at South Harting and West Harting, and there were hops grown at Bepton to the east of here. But this farm, to the best of my knowledge, never had any hops on it.
And how many people are employed on the farm now?
Well, my cousin farms it. I don't.
Right.
The farm, the area has changed very slightly. He does quite a lot of contract work. He probably farms approaching the same acreage as we had when I first in my childhood. You know, there were well over 20 people working on the farm. It's now just him.
Right.
It's now just him, and he has contractors in to help him at busy times, and obviously at certain times of the year when you've literally got to have another bottom sitting on another tractor to take the grain away from the combine which is cutting it. But fundamentally, he does it all by himself.
So that is extraordinary, isn't it?
He and large pieces of machinery.
And of course, the contractors won't have the relationship with the land that people who used to work here year in, year out had, would they?
Oh no, I mean, if nothing else, they won't know where the wet holes are. I've seen one wonderful instance of a farm near here, which you would think was a dry farm, which has a piece of quicksand on it, and a contractor's vehicle completely buried in the ground. And that vehicle, but the old boys who know better shook their heads and said, "Oh, you shouldn't have been anywhere near it." But there again, the contractors now, gone are the days when they are very specialised. They tend to have very specialised equipment. But I have a neighbour who farms an even larger farm with some seriously big equipment, and he does his office work from his combine. He can set the combine in the row. The combine's header follows the ground automatically. It has a camera at the edge of the combine cutting head to steer him down the row so that you get all the grain in the combine and don't leave too much of a gap. And he could ring up people and order his next lot of diesel in to keep this thirsty monster on the go.
So it's on autopilot.
It is virtually on autopilot. Oh yes. And up there is steering you as well. GPS. All this equipment, all this, you mark out a field now from GPS. So GPS tells you what to do. GPS can tell you places where the grain, where you had either a good yield of grain in a certain area, really quite small certain area, and a bad one. And it will increase the amount of fertilizer automatically out of the fertilizer spreader as you go through it to compensate for the area which is probably a little infertile, and cut it back for the area which is obviously more fertile. I mean, I couldn't start. I used to be able to do most things to a tractor and take them apart and put them back together again. I wouldn't even know how to start a modern tractor. They are so complicated. They're all electronic. They're all automatic. There's nothing easy about them. And the moment they break down, you can't just get out what we used to get out, which was a hammer and an adjustable spanner, and mend it. You have to send off for an expert with a computer to do it for you. So there are good and bad sides to it.
Yeah, well, almost like modern cars.
Well, it is. Yes, it is.
You can't really fix anything yourself, can you? You have to take it into the dealer.
I was at Redford, close to your last interview, for 6 years. So that's why I was there running that farm there as part of this farm. But
right,
that was a.
Oh, so did your father own the farm? Was it you tenant farmers?
Over at Redford, it was a tenancy of somebody who lived there. Yes.
So Redford, you were the manager. Is that what?
Well, no, actually, I was more sort of, I didn't so much manage it for the owner. I basically farmed it as I wanted to, and after 6 years, I decided that there was more to do here, and came back here. Came back to Elsted.
And how long did you carry on farming here then? or fairly recently?
Well, yes and no. We gave up keeping the 3 herds of cows in the mid 1980s because it took a lot of people to milk 3 herds of cows. That was 3 dedicated cowmen, 1 each, plus more than 1 relief cowman, because to cover their time off, you needed more than 1 person to do that. So we needed the best part of 5 people to milk these cows. And I said to my father, this is ridiculous, because of all the costs involved, we'd be better off milking a smaller number, which is what we duly did, and we were better off. The problem was, by concentrating them all in one place, we ran into the problem of such issues as manure handling, animal health, too many animals in one place in buildings which weren't suitable. The milking parlour was stretched, it needed major work done to it. It was fairly obvious that none of these jobs could be done within the existing umbrella. We couldn't rebuild, expand what we had. We'd have had to have started on a new site. And we really thought hard and fast about this, because Father loved his cows and they were his pride and joy, and it's what really prompted my grandfather to leave the city and come farming. And so we decided to give them up. So in August 1991 we sold the cows. Well, effectively selling the cows, and because by then my uncle was farming the arable completely separately, I was a bit footloose and fancy-free, but I was rather young to be footloose and fancy-free, and so I started doing local government, quite a lot of local government work after a while. I took myself off for a walk around Britain, so I did that.
How long did that take?
Oh, I was away for 6 months, but I did go to Lizard and the Land's End and John O'Groats, so I did walk over 3,000 miles to do that.
Gosh.
Yes, it was.
What a wonderful thing to have done.
Well, it was, yes. That was, what are we now, 24 years ago.
So did you go to the local school here when you were a child?
Up until the age of 8, I went to there was a little village school in Elstead. Like so many villages, it had its own village school, and Elstead's lasted longer than some.
What do you remember of that school?
Oh, I can remember there were 2 maiden ladies, as one used to call them in those days, Miss Head and Miss Glue, who both came from South Harting. And Miss Glue's father had the thrashing tackle, so he was the last person in this area who thrashed out corn stacks of corn before the combine became totally ubiquitous. So he did that, and Miss Head's father was the village postmaster. But these 2 ladies, they were lovely. Miss Glue was a bit fearsome. She beat me once for putting a girl's hair in an inkwell. She still lives in South Harting. She's not a girl any longer. And but she thought that was just beyond the pale, so I got smacked for that. The days when even women did things like that.
Yeah.
And I was there until I was 8, and then I went away to boarding school because I went I was in a cathedral choir, so I went away to Somerset to boarding school.
Just going back to the village school, how many children were there when you were there?
Oh, I'm trying to think. There were, I should think there were probably 50 or 60.
Quite a few then.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, there were more prior to 1952, when obviously there was the change in secondary education and secondary modern schools came in, because one lost the children between the ages of 11 to 14 to the secondary modern. But there was still quite a number. But that school was closed in 1985, and a new school built in South Harting to cater for Elstead and Harting.
And you were saying you still know the girl who's now had her pigtails in the ink. Roughly speaking, of those 50 or 60 children you were at school with, how many do you think are still living in this area?
It's a surprising number, because South Harting, with a very large ex-council estate, there are a lot of people who were a lot of the people I was at school with are still around. Of course, they're all retired now. They're all getting quite old, but it's surprising how many of them are about, and I bump into occasionally. But most have gone, of course. There's, I really I doubt there's much more one can say about it. It's just that it was very different then. Everything was much easier. I can remember the school children walked in from miles away, and on a summer's day or on a day like today, after school was over, they'd mooch back home to Treyford, a mile away, to Diddling, 2 miles away. They'd mooch back along the side of the road, and it would take them an hour to get or more to get home. And they used to enjoy themselves. They used to be able to see everything happening. They knew where all the birds were nesting.
Yeah. And were there still facilities in the village then? Shops, village shops.
Elstead here has never had a shop. There was a tin shop next to the Railway Inn, as it then was, down at the lower Elstead.
Oh, was there a railway stop at Elstead?
There was a railway station, yes, there was a railway station.
So when that closed, that must have impacted to some extent, didn't it?
Well, yes and no. I mean, you'd be surprised how many people had never travelled by train. If only because the buses were so much more convenient. There was a lady who lived not so far away from the station as was in Elstead Marsh, and she told me that the early morning train was their alarm clock. They didn't have to buy one until they had an alarm clock, but she never travelled by it. And and a lot of people, it's always said that a lot of people travelled long distances by train, and unless you commuted to school, and a lot of people around here commuted to school either in Midhurst or Petersfield by train, but for day-to-day work, for day-to-day stuff, it really wasn't very convenient because the railway split the difference between the two villages, so it was convenient to neither.
Okay, yeah. So you went away then to boarding school, and where did you say that was?
Well, it was actually at Wells in Somerset. So I was there for 8 years, and then came back and went to school in Midhurst between 1966 and 68 before going away to Agricultural College in Devon.
Right. Which college was that?
Steelhain.
Oh yes, yeah.
Which is gone now.
It's
no longer there.
So you went to Agricultural College, and then you came back to work on the farm? I
came back here, yes. I mean, I did crazy things. I went and ran a pub in Australian outback for a while.
Oh wow!
as one does. I ran a pub in the Australian outback for a man who was had retired from being British Chargé d'Affaires in Moscow. I know he's dead now, so I can't say anything but he was an extraordinary fellow, as you might imagine. And there he was out in Australia.
Wow.
And he had the lease on an outback hotel, and his manager needed to go needed a holiday, and was beginning to say, look, if you don't give me a holiday, I'm off. So he said to me and my then girlfriend, go and would you run the pub at Wim Creek? And Wim Creek Hotel was 1,100 miles north of Perth, Western Australia. It really was in the back of nowhere, and it had lots of customers.
Gosh. Is it still there today?
Well, yes, it is. You can look it up on the internet. Its future's a little shaky because it was there because there was a copper mine next door, a very high grade copper ore seam which was mined, and depending on what the market was, they would either stop or start the mine. But the pub kept going, and it was right next door to the bitumen highway, to the what is it? I think in gross tonnage terms, the busiest port in the southern hemisphere, a place called Port Hedland, where they literally had a train which brought 100,000 tons of iron ore down one train to that pub one day. I mean, the numbers are phenomenal. The figures of what they shift. Most of Western Australia was on its way to Japan when I was there. Most of it's on its way to China today.
Gosh.
Yeah.
So how long were you there?
Oh, out in Australia for 6 months. So it was a relatively short period of time. And
and your father was still alive, running
Oh yes,
Maybe,
yes.
yeah.
My father and my uncle. My father died relatively young. He had a very bad crash during the war.
One thing we haven't really talked about, except in passing, is the downs. Have you noticed any change into the farming of the downs, the appearance of the downs, the use of the downs?
Well, if you've been sitting here when I was a young boy, you would have seen the odd clump of yew trees up there, but not any more than that, because in 1960 the forest. You see where there's a line of fir stops on the top up there.
Yeah, yeah.
From there, running back to around there, that is a block of 108 acres planted by the Forestry Commission in 1960. And what they did is they planted rows of trees up the downs. They planted, I think it was about 4 rows of western red cedar, thuya, and then a row of beech. The idea being that the western red cedar would be the nurse for the beech, so that the beech would grow up. But of course, you don't plant trees like that on the downs, because there's only that much soil and they go down and hit the rock. And also beech is very shallow rooted at the best of times. So they religiously hand weeded, using fag hooks, the side of the downs for 2 or 3 years, and then they left them to it. And these trees grew up and then stopped, because they suddenly said, hey, we've run out of nutriment, we've run out of growing medium. And really, what you see up there has been there now for 60 years and is a nothing. It's on the scarp slope, it's on slopes of 60 degrees, they can't do anything with it. There's the odd track round there, but short of putting in aerial, what do you call it?
Yes, tripwire.
Overhead stuff to pull them down. It'd be terribly difficult to get the stuff down, even with modern machinery. It's uneconomic to move an awful lot of it. So that was bare woodland. That clump on the hill above South Harting over there, sit here 60 years ago, that wouldn't have been there. That has self-sown itself.
Oh, really?
That was the site of a windmill up there. There was a windmill on top of that hill, but that was gone by about 1800. But all the sides of the downs have grown up. They have all grown up in the last 100 years. That's what's happened there. On the top of the downs, the tops of the downs, the very tops, were sheep runs until the Second World War. Second World War, of course, it was plough up for agriculture. And the top of the Beacon Hill, the top of Pen Hill, and Harting Hill, there are 2 big separate areas on Harting Down, which belongs to National Trust. And they were all planted up for arable crops. There's a wide valley between the Beacon and Harting Hill, and that has got very deep soil in it, and my family grew potatoes in that up on the top of the downs. But in about we kept farming it after the war until somebody realised we were still farming it and said, no. So in about 1953, we were told to pull out, reseed it, and we put it into grass again, and that was that. I can remember one of my early memories being some piles of hay left up there. So obviously somebody had cut it for hay, and for some reason that hay hadn't been moved. The top of I can recall the Up Park estate combining the tops of what are called Round Down and Harting Down in the early 1970s. I can recall their combines being up there. They again were told, come on, common land, off. They just pulled out, they didn't reseed it. So the ground naturally recovered, and it recovered with much better, because they didn't plant an invasive grassland type, all the wildflowers came back. And now there's lots and lots of wildflowers on the top of that down. It's as good as any downland soil.
Round or Harting
Round Down. You've got Harting Down is behind that clump, and Round Down is the is the slight rise this side of it. If you look at an large-scale ordnance survey
You've
map,
got lots of wildflowers there now.
there are. Oh, there's.
And what about the valley where you had the potatoes?
Oh no, I was going on to say the valley. All that does is gets ragwort.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So that hasn't got the wildflowers in
No.
it because the wildflowers weren't able to compete with the grassland which was put down there. We grew cereal crops and we put and grassland rotations on the tops of those two hills there, but we stopped doing that some years ago, and
So
that was the change, but now that's been stopped. That's now stopped. That's in grassland again now.
So less of the downs are in cultivation than they were, but
Well-
there's more woodland. Would that sum it up?
Yes, this is self-sown woodland. The other side of the downs, there was a lot of woodland planted on what were sheep runs in the 1860s. It's the dog being a nuisance. It's the 1860s, but that was planted for pheasant shooting, and B for commercial woodland. And the censuses from about 1870, 1880 show you that what were the farm workers' cottages were now lived in by bodgers and other woodworkers whose places of birth were places like High Wycombe. So they came from the centre of a chair-making industry. So these people were people who came and worked the woodland in the woods to make chair spindles and chair seats, etc., etc. And that's the sort of fact that I find out. Those are the sort of facts that I write about.
And you see, involved in local government. Do you mean as a councillor? or-
Yes,
yeah.
I was a district councillor. I'm still on the South Downs National Park Authority, and but I'm chairman of 2 parish councils as well.
Oh, well, which ones?
Well, the one here in Elstead, and the one next door to the west of us in Harting Parish. But even that, it's surprising how much work that entails.
I'm sure. Yeah.
This morning I had a meeting using Zoom, as one does, with the vice chairman and the clerk to Harting. We discussed an issue to do with the village hall and how we were going to deal with that and the best way to start dealing with it. But there are all sorts of things, all sorts of current things. It's quite exciting. But of course, there's the uncertainties of the future. We don't know how much money there's going to be in local government, in county and district, and what they're going to be doing in the future. So, I do think we're going to have to take on more services, but we don't have the money.
No.
We don't have the resources in terms of the knowledge of the employees, the paid employees. County and district have financial departments, they have legal departments, they have people trained in all the relevant areas. If we're expected to do something, are a bit in the dark. But I'm also very worried that an awful lot of people are not getting involved in doing things for communities, and I think the way I look at it is they move into an area because it's nice, but they don't do as much as they should to do their bit to ensure it stays nice, to oil the wheels of keeping the show on the road, to mix my metaphors.
I was going to ask you that actually about community spirit and whether that had changed, and if so, how.
I think it is, yes. I think people's ethos isn't as great as it was for volunteering. They'll volunteer for one-off things, but they won't volunteer for the long term, to stick with things, to be there should something happen. They'll deal with something which is there and needs dealing with, but they won't be that person who's on standby. And you do need both. You obviously need people to deal with issues as they arise, but you also need people to be on standby.
I'm assuming there's a different demographic now, that the average age in the village is higher than it would have been 50 years ago. Would that be right?
Oh, I think very definitely, because not only are families smaller, but also there's fewer young families. Though interestingly enough, I think there are more younger families than there probably were 20 years ago. I think there were more retired people because the younger ones had to live closer to their place of work. And so they didn't come here until later when they had got rid of their families or they only came to visit them infrequently. But there are very few young people now in. There are actually few going to the local schools from this parish. Most of them, as I say, they're lived in by families who are wealthy enough to they send their children to private schools, either boarding schools or
Sure. So
day schools.
is the South Harting School safe?
Yes, it is at the moment. Yes, I think it is. There was a bit of a hiccup about a couple of years ago when no school was safe under 200 pupils. There were big moves to either amalgamate schools into campuses of 200 plus, until it was pointed out that the impact of that would have devastating effects. And I think people realised just how important to a community a village school is.